So today I wanted to take a little bit of time to show you guys how to finish up your projects from last year. This would be some students that were in Woodworking 1 last year. You made this footstool out of 2x4s, and we were right to the kind of toward the end part of the project when we went on lockdown. So I just wanted to show you a few tips. Recently I showed some videos how to do some staining and also finishing, just kind of refresher stuff. And I just wanted to take a minute to show you a little more in depth with the actual project you're going to be working on, things to look for and to be aware of before you get started. One of the first things I'd recommend before getting started in any kind of project where you're going to be staining is to finish your work, or to cover your workbench with some cardboard or something. You know, even if it's a workbench and you don't mind getting stain on it, over time, if you continue to get wood glue and stain build up on there, and if you don't keep it cleaned off, it's gonna just become a mess over time, and you'll have a really bumpy surface to work. So before you start staining, one thing that you always have to remember is the surface preparation is probably the most important part. If you have scratches or dents where the wood's been compressed, those spots will either come out lighter or darker because they're not going to take stain the same way as the rest of the wood. If you have places that are splintered really bad, those will always be there and you can get splinters off them, so you need to make sure you take care of that before you stain it. This is a project that was done by a student a couple years ago. They never finished it, they didn't want it, and there are a number of flaws, and that's why I'm going to go ahead and use this as a example of what not to do. So I'm just going to take a minute to point out some of the flaws. Right here we have, it was kind of looks like a scratch, but it was actually a place that was pressed in, and it basically compressed the wood. And so places like that, it's not going to absorb the stain as well, and so it's going to be lighter. And then you've got places like this. You can see a dark line here. That was a scratch, so the wood was actually tore up and gouged, and so the stain soaked in darker there, and so you have dark lines. Then in this area you've got more of a blotchy sort of look, and probably when he sanded it he used a coarser grit and he never got down to the 220 grit, which will really smooth that wood out even more. So those are a couple things to look for. Another thing is, like right here, you have a splinter. I could really easily splinter myself on that. Normally, if a board like this was still raw wood, I would wood glue that. I would tape it down or clamp it down, let it dry, and then I would deal with it, sand it out, try to clean it up. This one's a little trickier because there's already stain back in here. So if I wood glue it, it's not going to really hold properly. So I may have to route it a little bit deeper, and but I do need to do something to that to make sure that there's no splinter on this stool. You can also see right here is another kind of flaw that you might see. And all this is this is a place where when the person stained it, if you remember, when you stain something, you want the stain to soak in, and then you want to wipe off the excess completely. It's not like paint where it stays on the surface and hides what's underneath it. Stain actually adds color and adds it actually draws attention to the contrast in the wood grain. So right here, what you see, all this splotchiness, is where the stain was applied, and when they wiped it off, they didn't wipe all of it. And so the extra stain that was left there looks darker. Right here is another place where you can see some scratches all the way across. And what happened there is the student took some sandpaper and they went across the grain. Remember to sand with the grain, because if you go across it, it's going to leave these scratches that are going to be ugly. And lastly, another thing that you want to look for, there may be other things I'm not thinking of right now, but another flaw that's quite common is getting wood glue on the surface and not cleaning it properly, not sanding it out. So this was a spot of wood glue, and you can see it repelled the stain, so it leaves like a lighter colored spot. So normally when you see wood glue on a product like this, it's going to be in the area where you assembled it. We actually sanded these parts before we assembled them to make the job easier. If you were careful and you were able to keep all the excess glue from oozing out, or if you clean it up really well, you may not have to do anything here. But if it's all dried on there, at this point, you're going to have to get a piece of sandpaper and you're going to have to sand that wood glue off. If it's on the underside, it's not that big of a deal. Nobody will really ever see it. But if it's a product that you want to sell, people with a trained eye, they're going to look at that and they're not going to be too happy, and they're not going to think much of your quality of work. But I'm going to do what I can with this stool that a student didn't finish. I'm going to try to clean up those spots and get them out of there for you, and then show you how to stain it. Some of you filled these, or you put plugs in there. This one does not have them. At this point, I'm not going to. You could put wood filler, which really doesn't look as nice as wood plugs that were glued in. But just make sure when you sand these also to sand off the wood glue. And if your drill, like this one, I can see the chuck of the drill actually pressed in when he drilled his holes, and it left a ring around there. We're going to want to sand that out as well. If you have a orbital sander, or some would call it a DA sander, you can use that. If not, you're going to have to sand them by hand. I did give some of you sandpaper when I gave these projects out to you. But just make sure when you're sanding to sand with the grain. You can start with a 120 grit if there's quite a few imperfections that need worked out of there. But always make sure that you finish with the 220 grit, the fine grit sandpaper. So that kind of wraps up a lot of things I look for when I'm doing the surface preparation. I'm going to go ahead and sand this one down, and once I get those scratches out of there, I'll stain it for you. And you can always sand it off and restain it, but it's better if you get the surface right the first time. If you're not discovering those scratches until you have the stain on there, that's not really a good thing. There are techniques you can use. Some people like to put water on there. When you put the water on there, the wood, it kind of brightens up. It looks yellow or orange, well, depending on the kind of wood you're using, but it changes the color a little bit. But it also will highlight those places where there's scratches and dents. And but then you need to let it dry. And then if you put water on it, it tends to raise the grain on the wood, and you're going to have to sand, at least lightly sand it again. You can also use mineral spirits, which a lot of stains are compatible with. But if you put that on too soon before the stain's probably going to look lighter on there. You're probably going to want to make sure that it dries out completely before you apply the stain. But by getting it wet with some mineral spirits or some water, you will be able to see the imperfections before you put the stain on, which will save you quite a bit of time later. So what I think I'm going to do with this splinter, I'm just going to go ahead and try to route it a little bit deeper. I didn't have any set specifications for you guys on these projects. Some of you rounded these over. I had considered rounding it over, thought of a couple different options, but I think I'm going to try to go just a little deeper with the bevel and see if it'll take that out. So anytime you use a router or any kind of power tools, you want to make sure you wear your safety glasses. I can actually go without my prescription glasses because I mostly use them for the bifocal reading lens. So if you have glasses, you may not want to take them off if it's going to make it hard for you to see. That wouldn't be safe either. But you want to wear some safety glasses that are designed to go over your glasses. successfully took out the splinter, so now I should be able to sand it without getting splinters and also stain it, and it shouldn't give you splinters after the product's done. I'm going to try to sand this completely clean, which it does get difficult when you're getting into the corners where it was assembled, the underside especially. I may not be able to get it all the way off in some of these spots, but I am going to stain it a very similar color. I think it's like a dark walnut or something, so I should be able to get it pretty close. This is why you don't want to stain it before it's ready. And you know, if this was, if he was to finish this project, the student that was making it before, I would just have had him finish it. Maybe touch up places where there were splinters, and I probably wouldn't have had him go this far. But since I'm going to be showing you guys how to stain, and I don't have a stool made to show you, I'm going to try to get this one sanded down as best I can to show you. I'm going to go ahead and start with a 120 grit. I think that should be enough. You can use a coarser grit. You can go to a 100 or an 80 grit. The problem is, especially with an Orbital sander, what's going to happen is it's going to leave swirl marks on the surface of your wood, and especially if you're using a soft wood like fir, because these, like I said, these were made out of 2x4, so it's a softer wood. It will leave swirl marks on there, which you will then have to sand out with a finer grit sandpaper. So I'm going to try the 120. I think it'll clean it off just fine. As it wears out, it may not. I may have to replace it, but I try to be conservative with my sandpaper. It's expensive. I try not to use more than I have to, but if you're really sanding aggressively like this, you might need to go through a couple pieces. With you that are at home, make sure you sand it right. If you don't have a sander like this, if you're to sand that out all the way by hand, it's going to take you quite some time. So you want to make sure before you stain it to get this surface prepared properly. As I'm sanding it, one thing that I'm noticing, and you probably will be able to see it here, there's a line right here. It's a little hard to see from that far out. And that's what you call a snipe mark. And basically, when this panel was run through the planer, the end of the board, it sniped out a little bit, and it just went a little bit deeper there. And I always try to tell students to sand those out as well. Sometimes it didn't appear that much when he stained it, but sometimes it will really jump out and you'll see those lines. I'm definitely seeing it now as I'm sanding it, but you want to try to make sure your snipe marks are sanded out before you stain your project as well. One thing to remember is when you're sanding the wood grain on the end grains, you want to sand a little more, make sure to really smooth it out. You almost get to the point where you're almost buffing it out. You're going to have to sand deeper to really smooth out the end grain. Also, you want to remember when you're sanding these bevels, you don't want to round them over. So you want to make sure that you keep them nice and consistent. You don't want to focus too much on one spot, especially if you're using a DA sander. The smaller the edge, the more aggressive that sander is going to be against it. So on a large surface like this, I mean, you can almost press pretty hard. I mean, you want to let the sander do the work, but when you get on these edges, you can sand it with a sander like this, but you need to be really careful to keep it at the same angle as that bevel and not to focus too much on one spot. It's going to be pretty quick. These ends are a little flatter. You can go a little longer, like I said, but you want to be careful not to be tipping it and creating a change in the way that bevel looks. These sides aren't going to take as much sanding as the end grain, but these ones were cut pretty rough, and part of what caused the splintering when he did it before, it was just like, it was never really sanded too good to begin with. So those are just a few tips. Try to maintain the edge that you have there. Now, if you have one of those stools that you rounded over with a radius bit, when you go to sand this, you're not gonna wanna just sand it back and forth like this, because it's gonna get ridges, flat ridges across it. You're gonna kinda need to, now you might wanna start like that to get the real rough stuff off, but then to finish, you're gonna wanna kinda go around it like this with nice even pressure, going from flat on the side all the way to the top. And that will give you a nice rounded edge. And then lastly, you can always take your 220 grit by hand and go ahead and sand that. And just be really careful if you're going with the grain, make sure there's no splinters or anything, because you don't want those to, you don't want to get splinters in your fingers when you're sanding. So you probably don't want to sand the bottom here. The saw cut is going to be nice and flat, so if you start sanding on that, you're not going to have a flat surface for the floor. Another thing, when you're sanding this end grain, you can see like right here, it looks almost dusty. You don't see the wood grain quite as bright as you do in some of these places, especially the other side. I've sanded a little more, and when you sand the wood grain enough, those colors are really going to pop out. You're going to see the contrast between the harder parts of the wood and the softer parts. So if it looks dusty across the entire surface, even while you're sanding it, and you're not seeing that wood grain pop out, it's because you're on the end grain, and it's really porous, and it takes more sanding to get that smoothed out real nice. So I always try to look for that wood grain to brighten up, and this is going to brighten up even a little bit more once I go down to the 220 grit. So try to buff that out to where it doesn't just look kind of dusty. You want to really see those that wood grain pop out to know that you sanded it well enough. Just another flaw that you want to look out for when you are finishing and doing staining, and that is the saw curve. You can see when this was cut on the saw, it left these blade marks here. So you also want to make sure that you sand those out before you stain your product. I have most of it sanded now. I'm trying to sand out these corners. When I was using the orbital sander, I was just being really careful not to hit the corners with the edges of that, because it can scratch it up there and make the stain darker in those places. So, but I'm actually sanding the rest of those corners away by hand. And I'm also going to hit these edges by hand, because there's no way to do it without boogering up this edge. And yeah, I'll do that. But when you guys get in here and you're sanding this part, you want to go with the grain. You don't want to go across, like, you don't want to go in and out like this. You want to make sure you go into the corner with the grain. And the same here. And then with this one, you're going to go this way with the grain. And just be careful when you're going up and down here. Just be cognizant of the fact that this grain is going in the opposite direction. So you could potentially put scratches in here. I would probably sand this part first, your leg, and then go into the corner like that. And that should make sure there's no scratches vertically here. Well, I think this is going to be good enough. I mean, I didn't do it perfect into the corners. This isn't really my project. I'm just fixing it up. I'm going to use a stain that's very close to the same color, so you never see it up in the corners there. So I've got this sanded pretty well. I mean, you get, like right here, there's a big flaw because there was a cut mark from the saw where you cut in the wrong place initially. But I mean, overall it's sanded pretty well. I haven't gone over it with the 120 or the 220 grit yet, so I am going to do that. You know, when you're sanding, you want to sand up into these areas. You don't want to go, like I said, once again, you don't want to go across the green. But I will go ahead and hit this by hand with the 120 grit. On the end grain, you're going to go across like that, but pretty much you're just going to want to stick with the grain. Now on these corners, they're pretty sharp. if a kid trips and falls and hits their head, it might split their head open. So you may want to just gently knock that sharp edge off. You can do that on these edges. I wouldn't want to round over my bevel, but you might want to soften that bevel just a little bit with your 220 grit sandpaper. And then I had mentioned possibly putting a bevel on the bottom. That will prevent the outer edge from chipping as it slides across the floor. You can use a router. I would usually set it up with about 1/8 of an inch bevel, maybe 3/32 or so. But you can also just take a sand block with this has probably got a 120 grit sandpaper on there. You could do a little more, and you can just go ahead and just try to keep it even, keep even pressure, and make that line look even all the way across. But I'm going to go ahead and do that, and that will save problems later after it's finished. I hit this edge, this one. There's a lot of ways you could do this, but I'm just going ahead and sand blocking it. So with your projects at home, I would highly recommend this. And don't do what I just did. You don't want to set your project on sandpaper because it'll scratch it up. I'm going to have to resand the top surface there where that hit. Make sure there's no scuff marks from it. That's another reason to work on the cardboard. The cardboard is a lot more gentle on your project. So even while you're sanding, now, I mean, some of this sand grit can get off and get on there, so keep it blowing off quite a bit. And I always try not to slide my project around too much. I try to pick it up and move it as much as possible. I don't know if you can see that bevel. Try to do it fairly even across there. Now, yeah, when this slides across the floor, sometimes that outer edge, if it's sharp like that, sometimes that outer edge, those fibers will snag and it'll peel back. And then if you use a darker stain like this, it's gonna leave like little white marks around the bottom. So we don't want that. So yeah, that's why we're beveling it. There's another thing I would recommend that you guys do, especially when you have these projects in class. I like you to wood burn your name somewhere, or your initials, or trademark, whatever you want. But I normally would have you put your name like in this area here that's kind of on the underside. Even if you want to sell it, it doesn't hurt to have your name on it. I believe woodworking is an art, so it doesn't, it's a good thing to go ahead and put your signature on it like you would any other piece of artwork. But also it helps when we're in class to have your name on it. It helps me when I'm grading so I don't get your projects mixed up. Okay, so now I've successfully sanded this. It should be ready to stain. It should, when you touch it, it should feel like baby skin. It should be really smooth. And if it's not, then you're probably not using a fine enough sandpaper, but it should be really smooth. You shouldn't see any scratches. I think I'm gonna go ahead and put some mineral spirits on here and show you what it should look like. That's a step that I don't normally use because I can feel it, I can see it, I can tell if it's going to take stain well from experience. But if you want, you could take some mineral spirits, you could wipe it on there. You're going to see it's going to brighten up the wood and reveal any scratches that may need sanded a little more. If you do that, I'd wait for the mineral spirits to completely dry before you apply your stain, because it may have a tendency to lighten the color of the stain. But yeah, I'll go ahead and do that, and then I'll make another video where we're actually staining this. So here we go. I'm just going to use a bit of t-shirt cloth to wipe this in, get it nice and wet. What you're going to see the wood color change. If you were to put a clear coat on it, it would kind of look like that. It would brighten it up a little bit. And when I'm doing this, if there's any flaws or scratches, they'll darken up just as they would if there was stain. Now, I can see a little bit right here, and you're probably not going to see it on the video, there's a little bit of feathery sort of look. When I stain that, that would jump out. So I may need to sand that. But anyway, with this being a softer wood, it's far more likely that those imperfections will jump out when you stain them. So they do make a pre-stained wood conditioner that you can put on that will help hide those flaws. But it does add an extra step, which it doesn't take long at all, really. But especially for somebody that's less experienced, it wouldn't hurt to put that on there. You're just gonna have to buy it. But yeah, you could go ahead and, if you wanna to see how it looks, you can wipe your mineral spirits over the whole thing and just see if there's any flaws that jump out to you. I'm not gonna, mess with that right now, but just wanted to kind of show you how it brightened the wood and revealed those scratches. If you see any scratches after doing that, you can go back and sand a little more and try to get those out of there, and then make sure it fully dries, and then you can apply the stain. Okay, so now you should know that the most important part of staining your project is the surface preparation. We have prepared the surface on this one. We've eliminated the scratches and a lot of the flaws. Next, I'll be putting together videos showing you how to apply the stain. And hopefully this makes sense. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to me and I'll try to clarify some things.